Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're wading into some incredibly challenging but really profoundly important territory. We're taking a close look at a stack of sources focused on understanding and healing from the very real damage caused by abusive parents.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff.
And navigating the complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD, that can be an agonizing result of those experiences. This is, it's deep shit that gets woven into the very fabric of who a person is.
It really is, and it's a reality for far, far too many people. The sources you've gathered, they offer crucial insights.
Right.
Not just about the nature of these enduring wounds, but importantly, actual pathways toward healing, towards rebuilding a life that feels authentic, feels safe.
So our mission today is basically to be your guides through this material. We're going to pull out the absolute key nuggets of knowledge, highlight what's really important.
Yeah, try to make sense of it all.
And hopefully land on some aha moments, you know, things that illuminate the path forward. Think of this as your roadmap for understanding the profound impact of these experiences and how, maybe against all odds, healing is genuinely possible.
It really is, because when the people who were supposed to be your foundation, your safe harbor, when they were instead the source of chronic harm, I mean, that betrayal, it cuts deeper than almost anything else.
Absolutely. So let's dive in. Let's start by understanding exactly what that level of trauma does.
Okay,
so let's start by really unpacking what CPTSD is. We often hear about PTSD, right?
Yeah, standard PTSD.
Usually linked to a single terrifying event, like a car crash, combat, a disaster, something like that.
Yeah.
But the sources make a really critical distinction here. CPTSD is different.
Absolutely different. The sources, they describe CPTSD as stemming from chronic, repeated interpersonal trauma.
Okay, chronic and repeated.
Yes, especially when it happens during critical developmental periods like childhood. And the key here is the interpersonal nature and the inescapability.
You're trapped.
You're tracked with the source of the harm. This is the absolute core of parental abuse trauma. It's not a single incident. It's a sustained, inescapable environment of danger or threat or emotional neglect.
Right. It's not just one bad day. It's the daily reality. And the sources really highlight that this is a profound betrayal trauma.
Exactly. That's the perfect term. It fundamentally shapes a child's developing sense of self, their understanding of the world, their capacity for trust. Because the very people who should be teaching you safety and love,
They're the ones hurting you.
they're the ones inflicting the damage. The impact of being trapped in that environment where chronic harm is just the norm, it forces the brain and the nervous system to adapt.
Adapt how?
Well, adapt to a constant state of alert, hypervigilance, or sometimes shutdown dissociation. The sources explain this essentially normalizes emotional dysregulation. It wires in these deeply negative self-beliefs.
So the trauma isn't just something that happened to you. It literally shaped your internal system, how you see yourself, how you operate. It became your operating system, almost.
Precisely. That's a great way to put it. And while people with CPTSD, they definitely experience the core symptoms of PTSD, re-experiencing through flashbacks or nightmares, avoiding reminders, being constantly on edge or hyper-aroused, negative thoughts, mood changes.
All the classic PTSD stuff.
Right. But CPTSD layers on these three specific clusters of symptoms. And this is where the sources really distinguish it, where it becomes its own thing.
Okay, and here's where it gets really interesting and specific to CPTSD, isn't it?
Yeah.
What are these three core disturbances? The sources call them disturbances in self-organization.
Yes. And the critical insight the sources highlight here is that CPTSD isn't just about reacting to trauma. It fundamentally disrupts the core organization of the self.
Wow.
It impacts how you regulate your internal world, your sense of who you are fundamentally, and how you connect or struggle to connect with others. The first disturbance they talk about is emotional dysregulation.
Okay, unpack that a bit more for us. What does that look like?
This means experiencing intense emotions that feel, overwhelming, incredibly difficult to manage. We're not just talking about having a bad mood here.
No.
We mean profound mood swings, persistent, crushing sadness, maybe explosive, uncontrollable anger, or even more subtle but just chronic struggles with emotional states like a constant low-level anxiety or numbness.
So the volume knob on emotions is just cranked way up, or it sometimes feels completely shut off, maybe?
Often, yes. It's a profound lack of ability to regulate those internal states, which makes sense, right? Because that's a skill you learn in safe, responsive environments.
Environments that weren't available.
Exactly, environments that weren't available. The second cluster is negative self-cognitions and disturbances in self-perception.
Okay.
This is about deeply ingrained behind damaging beliefs about yourself, thinking you're worthless, a failure, fundamentally bad, or just permanently damaged goods.
Oh, it's heavy.
Pervasive shame and guilt are hallmarks here. It's a feeling that the abuse didn't just happen to you, but that it somehow proves something inherently wrong with you.
That's a devastating weight to carry around, the idea that you are the problem, not the abuse.
It is, and it's often, the voice of the abuser that gets internalized. It becomes your own inner critic.
Right.
The third cluster is interpersonal hardship and disturbances in relationships. This shows up as significant difficulties in forming and maintaining healthy, stable relationships.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Issues with trust, obviously. A deep fear of intimacy, maybe social withdrawal, or conversely, sometimes repeating unhealthy, chaotic, or even abusive relationship patterns because, sadly, that's what feels familiar.
Which makes perfect sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If your very first relationships, the ones you needed most for safety, were unsafe and unpredictable,
Yeah.
I mean, trusting anyone else is going to be a terrifying challenge.
It's a direct consequence, absolutely. The sources point out that the formal recognition of CPTSD as a distinct diagnosis in the ICD-11, the International Classification of Diseases.
That's the big international diagnostic manual.
Right. That recognition is really significant. It validates the unique suffering and the complexity of this form of trauma. You basically need to meet the standard PTSD criteria, plus show significant impairment in these 3 areas of self-organization for an ICD-11 CPTSD diagnosis.
And that validation must be incredibly powerful for people. It's saying your experience is real, it's recognized, and it's distinct from experiencing a single trauma.
Exactly. It moves us beyond just listing symptoms to really understanding the core injury to the self, to identity, to connection.
Okay.
The sources also touch on the overlap and the distinction between CPTSD and borderline personality disorder, or BPD.
Yeah, I've heard they can look similar sometimes.
They can. Many symptoms appear similar: impulsivity, feelings of worthlessness, relationship instability, intense emotions.
So how do the sources differentiate them? What's the key thing?
Well, the key distinction, at least in the current diagnostic frameworks like ICD-11, is that CPTSD requires documented exposure to chronic repeated trauma, especially in childhood, as its defining cause.
Okay, that trauma history is mandatory for the CPTSD diagnosis.
Right. Now, while early relational trauma is very, very common in the history of individuals diagnosed with BPD.
Often associated.
Right, often associated. But chronic trauma exposure isn't actually a mandatory criterion for the BPD diagnosis itself. It's a subtle but important difference in the root cause emphasis within those formal diagnostic systems.
Okay, so the CPTSD diagnosis is specifically and strictly tied to that chronic trauma exposure as the origin point in the definition.
Yes, and the sources also reference neuroimaging studies. These suggest that the changes we see in brain structure and function might actually be more pronounced in individuals with CPTSD compared to those with PTSD from single events.
Wow. Tangible, observable differences in the brain just from being repeatedly abused over time. That's not just psychological. That's literally built into your physical structure.
It really underscores that biography becoming biology. Point we'll get to later. It is absolutely physiological. Now, let's maybe delve into the nature of the parental abuse itself. Because the chronicity and the sheer inescapability of these environments, that's what makes them so profoundly damaging. That's what fosters CPTSD. The child isn't trapped by a single event. They're trapped by the daily reality of their home.
Yeah, the sources break down different types of abuse, and it's really clear it's not just about physical harm, is it? Verbal and psychological abuse is highlighted. This is insidious stuff.
It truly is, just insidious. This includes constant criticism, belittling, humiliation, name-calling, threats. It's also, crucially, manipulation tactics like gaslighting.
Making you doubt your own reality.
Exactly, making the child doubt their own perceptions, their memory, their sanity, systematically destroying their trust in their own mind. Emotional blackmail, pervasive fear. These are tools of psychological abuse. And critically emotionally unavailable parents inflict deep wounds through neglect.
How so?
Just failing to provide consistent warmth, attunement, validation. That lack of mirroring of emotional support, it erodes self-worth. It prevents the development of a stable sense of identity.
So it's both the active tearing down and the profound absence of the vital building blocks you needed as a kid.
Precisely. Then the sources discuss narcissistic abuse.
Okay.
So, a parent with pronounced narcissistic traits, a lack of empathy, an insatiable need for admiration, a tendency to exploit others for their own needs.
Right.
This makes the child feel invisible unless they're somehow serving the parent's needs or reflecting glory onto the parent. Children can become burdened with managing the parent's fragile ego, or they're used as extensions of the parent. This often leads to extreme enmeshment, where boundaries are just completely blurred or non-existent, or parentification.
Where the kid becomes the...
Yeah, where the child is forced into adult roles, caring for the parent's emotional or practical needs, which fundamentally neglects their own development.
Yeah.
Their childhood is essentially stolen.
The kid essentially becomes the parent's caretaker or emotional regulator. That's just fundamentally backwards and deeply damaging.
It is. Terribly damaging. Parental substance abuse also creates these chaotic, unpredictable, and often, frankly, frightening environments.
Yeah.
Children in these homes frequently experience neglect, emotional unavailability because the parent's focus is consumed by substances, and terrifying inconsistency. You never know who you're going to get.
Right.
Parentification is also rampant here, too, as kids have to take on adult responsibilities for themselves, maybe for younger siblings. This just utterly undermines a child's sense of security and stability.
And then there's physical abuse, which is often the most, immediately recognizable form of harm. Direct violence, hitting, burning, restraining.
Yes. This directly endangers the child's physical safety, obviously. It leads to chronic fear, hypervigilance, always being on alert for danger, and it embeds this belief that the people who are supposed to be your protectors are actually dangerous and unpredictable.
But the sources make a really powerful point here, don't they? They stress that while physical abuse is visible, psychological and narcissistic abuse can be equally, if not more, damaging to a child's sense of self, their identity, their trust in their own mind.
They absolutely do. It's a critical point. The sources state clearly that youth exposed to chronic psychological maltreatment can exhibit PTSD symptoms just as severe as those who experience physical or sexual abuse.
Wow.
And on top of that, they often show higher rates of depression, anxiety, substance abuse later on, and significant attachment difficulties. The insidious nature, the constant invalidation, the gaslighting, these things directly attack the foundations of a coherent self. This systematic erosion of your reality, your sense of worth. That's what creates those profound, lasting, enduring wounds.
It's an attack on your very sense of reality, your ability to trust your own mind. That goes deep as hell.
It really, really does. And the sources note that effective treatment often needs to account for the specific nature of the abuse. Well, maybe focusing more on boundaries and identity work for survivors of narcissistic abuse, or addressing hyper-responsibility and trust issues for those who grew up in chaotic, substance-abusing homes. The focus might shift.
Okay, so these experiences leave enduring wounds, as the sources call them. What does that actually look like? Walking around in the world, living with that damage over a lifetime. What are the long-term consequences?
Well, the damage casts an incredibly long shadow. It impacts nearly every domain of life. Psychologically, survivors are at significantly higher risk for things like major depression, anxiety disorders, personality disorders. Cognitive issues are also very common.
Like what kind of cognitive issues?
Difficulties with executive functions. Those are the skills we use for planning, organization, working memory, self-control, cognitive flexibility. So this can really impact learning, attention, just getting through daily tasks. And of course, CPTSD itself is a major consequence.
So it messes with the fundamental way your brain processes information and functions in navigating daily life.
Yes, absolutely. Emotionally, the toll is immense. There are pervasive struggles with emotional regulation, those intense swings or persistent numbness we talked about earlier, chronic shame, self-doubt, self-hatred.
That feeling of being defective.
Yes, that feeling of being inherently damaged or defective is a really core wound for many survivors. Isolation, pervasive fear, a deep distrust that makes the world feel inherently unsafe.
And the relational consequences must be huge.
Right.
Given the trauma happened within relationships.
Absolutely devastating. The capacity for healthy relationships is severely compromised. Survivors often develop insecure attachment styles in adulthood.
What does that look like?
It can manifest as intense fear of intimacy or abandonment, difficulty trusting others, maybe anxious clinging in relationships, or avoidant withdrawal, pushing people away. It makes asking for help incredibly hard.
Because you learned early on that relying on others was dangerous, or at least unreliable.
Exactly. They learned the people closest to them weren't safe, so why would anyone else be? It's a brutal, logical conclusion based on their experience. Behaviorally, survivors might turn to risky coping mechanisms to manage the overwhelming internal pain, or just attempt to self-regulate in the only ways they know how. Things like substance abuse, self-harm, disordered eating, compulsive behaviors, or impulsivity.
And this is where that physical health connection comes in really strongly, isn't it? The whole biography becoming biology idea.
This is such a critical point the sources hammer home, and it's gaining so much more recognition now. Chronic stress from childhood abuse has a profound, measurable impact on the body over the entire lifespan.
How so?
The sources linked it to a significantly higher adult risk for a wide range of chronic physical health problems: diabetes, lung disease, heart attacks, arthritis, chronic pain conditions, high blood pressure, migraines, chronic fatigue syndrome. It's not just stress in the abstract.
No.
It's a dysregulation of the body's stress response systems that physically damages tissues and organs over time.
And you mentioned tangible brain changes earlier as well.
Yes. Reduced volume in key brain areas like the hippocampus, which is involved in memory, and the prefrontal cortex, involved in executive functions, has been documented in relation to childhood trauma. And critically, growing evidence points to epigenetic changes.
Okay, what are epigenetic changes?
This is where the trauma doesn't change your actual DNA sequence, but it alters how your genes are expressed, how they are read and translated into function in your body and brain.
Meaning the trauma can literally change how your body and brain function at a genetic level, potentially increasing vulnerability to certain issues, and might even in some ways be passed down. Holy hell, that's profound and terrifying.
It's a heavy reality, yes.
Yeah.
It really drives home that this trauma is biologically embedded. It's not just something you can get over by changing your thoughts or having a positive attitude.
No, it's in your cells.
In your cells. And the disruption of cognitive skills due to maltreatment also directly affects navigating adult life challenges, and education, employment, finances, communication are common. And these difficulties can create these vicious cycles of disadvantage that just reinforce those deep-seated negative self-beliefs. See, I am a failure.
Right. It confirms the narrative the abuse instilled.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Understanding how these experiences fundamentally impacted your brain, your body, your emotions, your relationships, your very sense of self.
Yeah.
It isn't about pathologizing you or saying you're broken beyond repair. Not at all.
No, absolutely not.
It's about recognizing the very real, pervasive biological effects of complex trauma and understanding why healing needs to be so incredibly comprehensive. It needs to address the mind, the body, the emotions, building practical skills, and fostering healthy connections.
Precisely. It highlights why a holistic approach to healing isn't just, a nice idea. It's essential. It's necessary.
Okay, let's move into the healing process itself,
Yeah.
because that's the hopeful part.
Yes.
For many survivors of parental abuse, a huge and often agonizing piece of this journey involves navigating the relationship, or sometimes the lack thereof, with abusive parents who are still living. The decision to go no contact is often one of the most difficult and pivotal choices a survivor might face.
It absolutely is. It's a monumental decision. And the sources frame it primarily as an act of self-preservation.
Self-preservation.
Yeah. It's about creating the necessary physical and emotional space for healing when continued contact actively causes ongoing harm, undermines recovery efforts, and essentially re-traumatizes the adult child over and over again.
What's the core rationale behind making such a drastic choice? According to the sources, why do people get to that point?
It typically comes from a painful realization, the realization that the abuse or the dysfunction is ongoing, that the abusive parents are unwilling or unable to change their behavior, acknowledge harm, or respect boundaries, and that any level of contact, even limited, continuously triggers CPTSD symptoms, pulls you right back into those harmful dynamics, and actively prevents healing. It requires a profound prioritization of your well-being, mental, emotional, physical, over those deeply ingrained societal expectations or feelings of obligation to family.
That sounds incredibly hard, because those expectations about family, loyalty, honor thy father and mother, they're hammered into us from birth, aren't they?
They are deeply ingrained. And the emotional landscape around that decision, it must be incredibly complicated.
Yeah.
It is. The sources describe it as complex and often paradoxical, full of contradictions. On one hand, there's often immediate and significant relief, peace, and freedom.
Space to breathe.
Yes. A reduction in the chronic stress, the anxiety, the emotional turmoil. Finally, space to just breathe without the constant threat or demand or criticism.
But that relief, I imagine, can feel profoundly wrong.
Yeah.
It must lead to immense guilt.
Yeah. Absolutely. It often feels deeply guilt-inducing because it's relief from a relationship you feel you shouldn't want relief from. Society doesn't give you permission to feel relieved about cutting off a parent.
Right.
And alongside the relief, there is often profound grief. And this isn't necessarily mourning the abusive person as they were, but mourning the relationship that never was. And now definitively never will be. It's grieving the longed-for, hoped-for parent, the one who was supposed to be kind, safe, validating the one you needed but never actually had.
So it's grieving an ideal, a potential that was never met, and now the door is slammed shut on even the possibility of that ever happening. That's a different kind of pain.
It is. The sources emphasize its grief for an intangible loss, which makes it particularly difficult for others to understand and validate. They might say, but they're still alive.
Right. Why are you grieving?
Exactly. Anger is also incredibly common. It can surface or intensify once that distance is created. Anger at the abuse itself, the stolen childhood, the lasting impact, and anger that the parent is living their life or maybe dies eventually without ever taking responsibility or being held accountable.
That lack of accountability must be infuriating.
Deeply. Then there's deep-seated guilt and remorse, fueled by those societal messages, maybe internalized blame. Maybe if I had just tried harder, maybe it was my fault. Or sometimes the abuser's own manipulations. How could you do this to me after everything I've done for you? Guilt about feeling relief? Guilt about not grieving right? Guilt about leaving things unresolved.
And I imagine just massive confusion trying to hold all these wildly conflicting feelings at the same time. Relief and grief and anger and guilt.
Definitely. The simultaneous presence of these disparate emotions is incredibly confusing. It can feel very isolating, especially if others around you don't get it or are judgmental. And then there's the potential loneliness, anxiety, or depression that can arise. The void left by the absence of family ties, even toxic ones, can feel significant.
And the backlash from outside the relationship is often brutal, isn't it?
Oh, it can be a huge challenge. Criticism and invalidation from others who just don't understand, including remaining family members who might still be caught up in the toxic system or friends who simply can't fathom estrangement.
Yeah.
Being labeled cold, unforgiving, selfish, too sensitive, dramatic, it adds an immense layer of pain and doubt. It's incredibly invalidating when you've made such a hard choice for your own survival.
So going no contact is the ultimate boundary, but maintaining it requires constant work, it sounds like.
Yes, boundary management becomes paramount. No contact isn't a passive state you just arrive at. It requires vigilance against potential breaches, unexpected calls, texts, emails, maybe showing up unannounced, attempts by flying monkeys.
Flying monkeys.
Yeah, that's a term often used for other family members or friends who are manipulated or enlisted by the abuser to try and bridge the gap, gather information, or deliver guilt-tripping messages.
Wow.
So you have to manage those external boundaries. But it also requires managing internal boundaries, fighting against self-blame, intrusive thoughts, second-guessing the decision, or allowing the abuser's critical voice to keep playing on repeat in your head. Maintaining these boundaries in all spheres becomes critical self-care.
And the sources make a powerful point that no contact isn't really an end to the healing journey. It's often just the start of the most intense internal work. Is that right?
Exactly right. Unprocessed pain and trauma responses often surface more acutely once that external threat is removed. The nervous system, which was maybe constantly reacting to the present danger, can finally begin to process the stored trauma when things quiet down externally.
So the quiet allows the old stuff to bubble up.
It really does. The societal stigma and potential backlash surrounding estrangement make external support absolutely crucial during this phase. Therapy becomes vital.
Why therapy specifically?
Well, it validates the difficult decision, which is huge. It helps manage the complex emotional fallout of the estrangement, the grief, the guilt, the anger, and importantly, it assists in building new, healthy support networks based on respect, validation, and understanding, which directly counteract the isolation and the old toxic patterns.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah.
You've removed the toxic relationship, but you absolutely need support from people who see your reality and value you.
Yeah.
So what are the core therapeutic pathways to healing from CPTSD that the sources highlight? How does healing actually happen?
Specialized therapeutic support is pretty much essential, and a trauma-informed approach is absolutely fundamental.
What does trauma-informed actually mean in practice?
It means finding a therapist who deeply understands the pervasive impact of trauma, who prioritizes creating an environment of safety, trust, collaboration, and empowerment above all else, and who is diligently working to avoid re-traumatization, which can happen easily if therapy isn't careful. Given that parental abuse shatters a child's foundational trust in their primary attachment figures—
The people you're supposed to trust most.
Exactly. The therapeutic relationship itself often becomes a crucial vehicle for healing. It can provide a corrective emotional experience, a safe, trustworthy connection that was missing.
Right. The therapist becomes that model of healthy relating that wasn't available before.
Precisely. The sources note that an integrative approach, drawing on techniques from various therapy models, may be most beneficial for CPTSD because it's so multifaceted. It affects so many areas.
Yeah.
There are several well-established and effective modalities the sources mention.
Can we maybe touch on a few briefly before we dive deeper into a couple of them?
Certainly. Trauma-focused CBT, or TFCBT, helps survivors challenge those abuse-related thoughts and beliefs, build coping skills for managing triggers, and involves safe, gradual exposure to traumatic memories to reduce their power over the present.
Okay.
Then there's EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. This uses bilateral stimulation, like eye movements, while focusing on abuse memories. It helps process them, reducing the emotional distress associated with the memory, and importantly, helps reframe negative core beliefs about oneself that stem from the trauma, like I am powerless or it was my fault.
Right. Changing those deep-seated beliefs.
Exactly. DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, was originally developed for BPD, but is highly effective for CPTSD too. It teaches crucial skills for managing intense emotions like anger, shame, fear that often get triggered by abuse reminders. It also helps improve interpersonal effectiveness, including setting healthy boundaries.
And you mentioned body-based therapies earlier, somatic therapies.
Yes, somatic therapies, like somatic experiencing, or SE. These approaches really focus on the body's role in storing and releasing trauma. They recognize trauma isn't just in your head, it's held in your nervous system, in your tissues.
How do they work?
They help survivors track physical sensations associated with the abuse, release trapped stress and tension from the body, and restore a sense of physical safety and calm. It's about working from the bottom up, from the body's experience.
Interesting.
Narrative therapy is another one. It helps survivors reauthor their life story, separating their identity from the trauma narrative imposed by the abuse and highlighting their resilience and strengths. And psychodynamic therapy can be useful for uncovering how repressed emotions and unconscious patterns stemming from the abuse influence present-day thoughts, behaviors, and relationships.
Wow, okay, so these sound like quite different angles of approach to the same core problem.
They are, and often skilled therapists will integrate techniques from several of these models depending on the client's specific needs and where they are in their healing journey. But the sources go into a deeper dive on two specific modalities that are considered particularly well-suited for the complexity of CPTSD stemming from early relational trauma: internal family systems, or IFS, and schema therapy.
Okay, let's dive into IFS first. Internal family systems. The sources describe the mind as having parts. That sounds a little abstract, maybe, or potentially pathologizing.
It can sound that way initially, but it's actually a really beautiful, compassionate, and non-pathologizing model. IFS offers a different way of understanding our internal world, our conflicts, our trauma responses. It posits that the mind is naturally multiple, composed of various parts, each with its own feelings, beliefs, memories, and motivations.
So not like multiple personalities, but different aspects.
Exactly. Not pathology. These are seen as valuable aspects of the self that have been forced into specific roles, often extreme ones, in response to difficult life experiences or trauma. They are trying to help, even if their methods are causing problems now.
Okay, so what are these parts?
The sources describe three main types of parts, plus the core self. First, there are the exiles, or sometimes called wounded parts. These are typically very young, vulnerable parts holding the raw pain, the fear, the shame, the terror, and the difficult emotions from the original trauma.
The parts holding the hurt.
Yes. They get exiled or locked away internally by other parts because their pain is just too overwhelming to bear in daily life. For a survivor of parental abuse, an exile might carry that deep-seated belief, I am unlovable, or hold the raw terror of a specific abusive incident.
Okay, the parts that hold the deepest, most painful childhood wounds. Makes sense.
Yes. Then there are the managers. These are proactive protector parts. Their goal is to keep the system running smoothly and critically, to keep those exiles' pain from surfacing and overwhelming the person. They try to manage daily life in ways that prevent triggering those deep wounds.
How do they do that? What do they look like?
Managers can manifest as perfectionism, people-pleasing, extreme self-reliance, intellectualizing feelings, being overly critical of oneself or others, or being rigidly controlling. Their intention, however misguided it might seem from the outside, is always protective.
They learned that certain behaviors kept the peace, maybe, or kept the really deep pain locked down in the abusive environment.
Exactly. They developed strategies that made sense then, even if they don't serve you well now. And then there are the firefighters.
Firefighters.
These are reactive protector parts. When the exile's pain does break through the manager's defenses, when a trigger bypasses the planning and control, the firefighters jump in with impulsive, often extreme behaviors to douse the emotional flames and numb the pain immediately.
Okay, like what kind of behaviors?
These can include things like substance abuse, binge eating, self-harm, rage outbursts, dissociation, shutting down, compulsive shopping, anything to distract or numb out right now.
Like an emergency response team trying to put out a raging fire, even if they cause more damage in the process of doing it.
Precisely. Their intent is always to stop the overwhelming pain now, whatever the cost down the line. And then, absolutely key to the IFS model is the core self.
The self.
Yes, IFS believe that at the core of every single individual is the self, which is characterized by qualities like compassion, curiosity, calm, confidence, courage, creativity, connection, and clarity, often called the 8 C's.
Okay.
The self is seen as the source of wisdom, the natural leader of the internal system. Trauma can cause Park to become extreme and protective, obscuring access to the self, but the self itself cannot be damaged or destroyed by trauma. It's always there, waiting to be accessed.
Wow. That's a profoundly hopeful idea that at your core, despite everything, there's an undamaged, wise, compassionate center. How is this applied to healing from parental abuse in therapy then?
In IFS therapy, the therapist guides the survivor to access that self-energy, to connect with that core of compassion, curiosity, and calm. From the courageous, centered stance of the self, you begin to understand and build relationships with your various internal parts. You learn to identify the wounded exiles holding the abuse pain, the protective managers who developed certain strategies to cope, and the reactive firefighters.
And you're not trying to get rid of these parts, you said.
Absolutely not. That would just be another form of internal exiling, right? Instead, you acknowledge their existence. You understand the positive intent behind the protector's actions, even if the results are problematic now. And with the self-leading, you compassionately approach the exiled parts.
How do you approach them?
The core therapeutic process involves getting permission from the protectors to access the exile, then witnessing the exile's pain and story from the compassionate perspective of the self, and helping that exile release the burdens they carry from the abuse.
Burdens like?
Those deep beliefs like, I am defective, or I am unlovable, and the overwhelming emotions like terror or shame. This is called unburdening. Once the exiles are witnessed and unburdened, the protector parts can naturally relax their extreme roles because they no longer feel they need to constantly protect the system from that overwhelming pain. They can take on new, healthier roles.
That sounds incredibly powerful, the adult self finally providing the wounded child part with the presence, the compassion, the validation, the safety it desperately needed, but never received from the abuser. It's like reparenting yourself from the inside.
It truly is a powerful form of internal reparenting. The sources note preliminary evidence supporting IFS for CPTSD. It's inherently non-pathologizing. It fosters deep self-compassion, and it aligns perfectly with trauma-informed principles by empowering the client's internal resources, the self, as the primary agent of healing.
Fascinating. Okay, let's look at the other modality highlighted. Schema therapy. What's the core idea here? How is it different?
Schema therapy, as described by the sources, is another integrative approach. It was specifically designed for chronic psychological conditions like CPTSD that often stem from adverse childhood experiences and, crucially, fundamental unmet core emotional needs in childhood. It draws on elements from CBT, psychodynamic therapy, attachment theory, and experiential techniques.
And the foundational concept here is early maladaptive schemas. What are those?
Yes. Schemas are deep, pervasive, negative patterns or themes about yourself and your relationships with others. They developed in childhood as a result of toxic experiences or the consistent failure of caregivers to meet essential emotional needs like safety, stable connection, autonomy, realistic limits, self-expression. They act like fundamental blueprints or filters through which you see the world and yourself, even if they are distorted by the trauma.
Okay, can you give me some examples, particularly ones relevant to parental abuse?
Sure. The sources list several key ones that often show up. Defectiveness shame, the core belief that I am fundamentally flawed, bad, broken, unworthy of love. Mistrust abuse, a pervasive expectation that others will inevitably hurt, manipulate, exploit, or abandon you. Emotional deprivation, the deep belief that your needs for nurturance, empathy, understanding, or protection will never be adequately met by others. Subjugation, feeling compelled to sacrifice your own needs, feelings, and desires to avoid conflict, anger, or abandonment from others. Self-sacrifice, excessively putting others' needs before your own, often out of guilt or a need to maintain connection. And approval-seeking, over-relying on external validation and recognition to feel okay about yourself.
Wow. These sound exactly like the core enduring wounds we discussed earlier, those deep beliefs and painful patterns left by the abuse.
They are essentially the internalized structures resulting from those wounds. Schema therapy also uses the concept of schema modes. These are the intense emotional states and coping responses that get activated when a particular schema is triggered in the present moment. For example, if someone has a strong defectiveness schema and receives criticism, it might trigger a vulnerable child mode, feeling small, ashamed, worthless like they did as a child, or maybe a punitive critic mode, viciously attacking themselves, internalizing the abuser's harsh voice, or perhaps a detached protector mode, shutting down emotionally, feeling numb, dissociating to avoid the pain.
Okay, so it's the schema and then the way you react or feel when it gets poked.
Exactly. The therapy helps identify these common modes and aims to strengthen the healthy adult mode, that part of you that can observe the situation, regulate emotions, make thoughtful choices, and respond to situations in a balanced, adaptive way, meeting your own needs appropriately.
How is schema therapy applied specifically to healing from parental abuse then?
Therapy focuses on identifying the specific schemas that developed as a result of the abuse and unmet needs. Understanding how they show up in your current emotional states and coping behaviors, your modes, and then using a range of techniques to challenge and modify these deep-seated, often lifelong patterns.
What kind of techniques are central to this? It sounds like more than just talking.
Definitely. There are cognitive techniques, similar to CBT, to challenge schema-driven thoughts. There are behavioral techniques to practice new ways of responding in relationships and situations. But a cornerstone, particularly for healing childhood trauma, are the experiential techniques, especially something called imagery rescripting.
Okay, imagery rescripting, what is that? It sounds intense.
It can be intense, yes, and it's always done with careful preparation and within a safe, trusting, therapeutic relationship. The goal isn't just to relive a difficult childhood memory related to the abuse. It's to alter the narrative and the emotional experience of it in your imagination.
How do you alter a memory?
The therapist guides you to revisit the memory in your mind's eye. But this time, you imagine your healthy adult self, or sometimes the therapist, entering the scene. This figure can protect the child you were, validate their feelings, provide comfort, confront the abuser within the imagery, and essentially give the child what they desperately needed at that moment but didn't receive.
So you're essentially providing the corrective, protective experience that was missing right there in the memory, changing the emotional meaning of that memory in your system.
Exactly. It's a powerful way to process the trauma emotionally and begin to heal that wounded child part by meeting those unmet needs in a safe internal space. It can change how the memory feels in your body now.
Wow.
Another crucial element of schema therapy, especially relevant for healing from early relational trauma, is something called limited reparenting within the therapeutic relationship itself.
Limited reparenting, what does that involve? Sounds tricky.
It means the therapist intentionally provides a safe, consistent, validating relationship that models healthy boundaries, empathy, warmth, and appropriate challenge. Essentially, the therapist provides a corrective emotional experience over time that directly counters the abusive or neglectful parenting the survivor received.
So the therapist models healthy attachment.
Precisely. The therapist doesn't replace the parent, of course, that's not the goal, but they consistently model what a healthy, safe, attuned relationship feels like, helping the survivor internalize a different way of relating to others and, importantly, to themselves.
That sounds incredibly healing, providing what was fundamentally missing in a safe professional context.
It is considered fundamental for healing deep relational wounds. Journaling is also often used in schema therapy, tracking schemas, triggers, modes, and practicing new, healthier ways of thinking and responding between sessions. The sources highlight schema therapy as particularly well-suited for CPTSD because it directly targets those deep negative self-perceptions and chronic relational difficulties. It uses powerful techniques like imagery rescripting to process trauma, and crucially, it focuses heavily on building self-compassion and correctly reattributing blame for the abuse entirely to the perpetrators.
That blaming piece seems massive, just keeps coming up. Getting survivors to truly understand deep in their bones that the abuse was not their fault.
It is perhaps one of the most crucial elements for liberating survivors from the crushing weight of toxic shame and guilt they were often deliberately burdened with by abusers. It's foundational. The sources provide a table, I think it's table 2, summarizing these core modalities, reiterating their primary focus and key techniques specifically tailored for abuse trauma. The overall message is really clear. Find a professional trained in trauma-informed care, and ideally someone experienced in one of these specialized modalities like IFS or schema therapy, EMDR, DBT, or somatic work. And consistently, the quality of the therapeutic relationship itself is highlighted as a huge predictor of healing success. Feeling safe with your therapist is key.
Absolutely. Because you're engaged in therapy, doing this deep, often difficult work. A core part of this process, regardless of the specific modality, is safely processing the traumatic memories and learning to manage the overwhelming emotions that inevitably come with them.
Yes. And the goal of processing traumatic memories, it's important to stress, isn't to just relive them pointlessly or become re-traumatized. That's not helpful.
Yep.
It's about reducing their intensity, integrating them as events that happened in the past rather than feeling like they are constantly happening now, and making them less debilitating in your present life. Giving them their proper place in your history, not your present.
How do these therapies approach that safely? You mentioned safety being key.
Well, techniques like the gradual paced exposure in TFCBT or the systematic desensitization process in EMDR introduce traumatic material very carefully. They ensure the client has built enough coping skills, enough internal resources, and feels sufficiently safe and stable before diving into the really heavy memory work. You build the container before you pour the difficult stuff in.
Right. Build capacity first.
Exactly. EMDR specifically helps reduce the emotional charge, the sheer intensity associated with the memory. This often leads to a significant decrease in flashbacks, nightmares, and intrusive thoughts. Imagery rescripting and schema therapy, as we discussed, actively alters the emotional narrative of the memory by adding that needed intervention or care. And parts work in IFS allows the core self to connect with and compassionately unburden the parts holding the memories, doing it in a contained, safe way.
It sounds like the emphasis is always on doing it in a controlled, supported, and paced way, not flooding the system.
Absolutely. Safety and pacing are paramount. You build the capacity to process before you actually do the deep processing. And alongside processing the memories, a massive part of healing is learning to manage the overwhelming emotions that were maybe a constant presence during the abuse and are so easily triggered later, things like intense anger, pervasive shame, crippling guilt, and overwhelming fear.
Yeah, these seem like constant, painful companions for many survivors. They just hijack everything.
They really can. Emotional regulation skills, particularly those taught systematically in DBT, are incredibly helpful here. Learning to identify your emotional triggers, understand the physical and cognitive components of your emotions, take steps to reduce your vulnerability to intense negative states, like getting enough sleep, managing stress, and practicing healthier ways of responding when those big emotions hit hard.
What about when you're already overwhelmed?
That's where distress tolerance skills come in, also from DBT. Learning how to cope with acute emotional pain without resorting to harmful behaviors like self-harm or substance abuse. Using techniques like intense exercise, temperature changes like holding ice, self-soothing through the senses, distraction, or connecting to meaning or values can help ride out the wave.
Mindfulness seems like it would play a role here too, just noticing what's happening.
It absolutely does. Mindfulness helps ground you in the present moment, which is critical for CPTSD survivors whose minds often get hijacked into the past by flashbacks or into the future by intense anxiety. It can help reduce hyperarousal and create a little bit of distance from overwhelming emotions or intrusive thoughts. It's about observing the feeling, okay, intense fear is here right now, without being completely swept away by it and connecting to the safety of the present moment if possible.
What about specific emotions that are really common, like anger? Abuse is a profound injustice, so anger seems like a totally valid response.
It is absolutely a valid, healthy, and necessary response to injustice and boundary violations. The goal isn't to suppress healthy anger. It's to understand its roots, often in powerlessness and hurt, and learn to express it assertively and healthily.
Like how?
Communicating your needs and boundaries directly and respectfully. Engaging in physical activity to release the energy. Or sometimes taking a time out when feeling flooded to avoid reacting destructively. It's about channeling the anger constructively.
And shame and guilt. You've highlighted these as particularly pervasive and toxic for survivors.
They really are, especially for survivors who were explicitly blamed or made to feel responsible for the abuse, or who simply internalized that something must be wrong with them for it to have happened. A core part of healing is challenging that harsh self-criticism, that relentless inner critic voice that often just mirrors the abuser's judgment.
So what's the antidote?
Developing self-compassion is the direct antidote here. Actively learning to treat yourself with the same kindness, understanding, and patience you would offer a close friend who had suffered similarly. Recognizing your suffering is real and valid.
And you stress that reattributing blame piece is crucial for tackling shame and guilt.
Fundamentally crucial. It requires cognitively and emotionally internalizing, truly getting it in your bones, that the responsibility for the abuse lies solely and 100% with the adult perpetrator, never, ever the child victim. This is paramount for releasing that inappropriate toxic shame and guilt that was unfairly foisted upon the survivor.
And fear and anxiety, which seem almost like the baseline state for someone whose nervous system was wired for constant threat.
These can manifest as chronic anxiety, hypervigilance, feeling constantly unsafe, or sudden panic attacks triggered by reminders. Grounding techniques are vital tools here.
Grounding technique.
Yes, techniques to pull you out of the flashback, the dissociation, or the panic spiral and anchor you firmly in the safety of the present moment and your physical body. Simple things like the 5-4-3-2-1 method.
Naming things you see, hear, touch.
Exactly. Naming 5 things you see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you hear, 2 things you smell, 1 thing you taste. Or just noticing specific details in your surroundings, the color of the wall, the texture of your chair, holding a comforting object, feeling your feet firmly on the floor, maybe even physically stomping your feet. These interrupt the trauma response and connect you to the fact that you are in the present and you are safe now.
So it sounds like healing really requires a combination of working with the thoughts and the narrative, what's sometimes called a top-down approach.
Yeah.
And working directly with the body and sensations, a bottom-up approach.
Exactly. Healing CPTSD effectively requires both. You need to address the cognitive distortions and the story, and you need to regulate the dysregulated nervous system and process the somatic imprint of trauma. Having a diverse toolkit of strategies to manage immediate distress while doing the deeper processing work over time is absolutely essential.
And a massive piece of this whole puzzle is rebuilding the sense of self that was so damaged, often intentionally, by the abuse. Cultivating self-compassion and rebuilding a positive self-identity sounds like core work.
It absolutely is. Parental abuse profoundly damages a child's developing sense of worth and identity. It's like trying to build a house on a shattered foundation. Cultivating self-compassion, as we've touched on, is the absolute antidote to the pervasive shame and self-criticism that takes root.
Remind us what that involves again.
It's about consciously challenging that inner critic, which, again, is often the internalized voice of the abuser repeating criticisms and put-downs, and actively replacing it with a voice of kindness, understanding, and support for yourself. Recognizing your shared humanity, that suffering is part of life and you're not alone. Mindfully accepting difficult feelings without judgment.
It's an active practice.
Right.
Not just feeling sorry for yourself. It's about actively choosing to be kind to yourself despite the pain and the history.
Precisely. The sources describe it as an act of courage, not self-pity. It directly counters the abuser's negative narrative that you internalized. And rebuilding identity is about reclaiming your agency, your sense of being capable of making choices, influencing your life, acting in your own best interest from the abusers who sought to control, define, and diminish you. It's about authoring your own story based on who you are becoming now, not who they told you were or who you had to be to survive then.
How do you actually do that day by day? It sounds huge.
It's often done incrementally. It involves systematically challenging those negative self-perceptions, actively disputing core beliefs like, I am unlovable, I am bad, I am incompetent, that were installed by the abuse. Therapy, especially modalities like schema therapy and IFS, are particularly effective in helping survivors identify, understand the origins of, and ultimately restructure these deeply held negative schemas and internal narratives.
And building self-esteem.
Yes, actively rebuilding self-esteem by focusing on your strengths, your talents, your positive qualities, however small they might seem at first. Celebrating small victories and achievements builds a sense of competence and mastery. Engaging in activities that bring you joy, pleasure, or a sense of accomplishment helps counteract the feelings of worthlessness or ineffectiveness. Therapy helps deconstruct the abuser's narrative of your worthlessness and helps you build a sense of internal worth that is solid, that's independent of any external validation or criticism.
Separating who you are fundamentally from what happened to you, and crucially from what they said about you.
Yes. Separating your core identity from the trauma. The trauma is a part of your history, a significant part, but it does not have to define the totality of who you are. Narrative therapy, as mentioned, helps externalize the trauma, seeing it as something that impacted you rather than something that is you. IFS helps connect you to that core self, which remains whole and undamaged beneath the protective parts and trauma burdens.
Right.
For many survivors, particularly after pervasive psychological abuse or neglect, there's a fundamental lack of a cohesive, integrated sense of self. They might feel fragmented or unsure of who they really are. Therapy helps piece together an authentic self based on your values, your choices, your experiences, rather than the distorted reflection presented by the abuser or the survival roles you had to play.
It sounds like a really long and complex, but ultimately liberating process, finding out who you are outside of the trauma.
It is, and it's very nonlinear, absolutely. There are breakthroughs and setbacks. It requires immense patience, persistence, and consistently challenging those old, deeply ingrained patterns of thinking, feeling, and relating. This internal work on self is deeply intertwined with building a sense of safety and forming healthy relationships, which often happen concurrently and support each other.
Okay, let's transition now to another incredibly complex aspect of this journey.
Yeah.
What happens when an abusive parent dies? This must be uniquely fraught with difficulty and confusing emotions.
It absolutely is. The sources describe it universally as a different kind of grief, one that is almost never simple or straightforward, like maybe grief for a non-abusive parent might be. It often triggers a maelstrom, a real storm of conflicting, contradictory emotions, and it's vital to understand that all of these feelings, however uncomfortable, are valid in this context.
Conflicting emotions, like what comes up?
Well, a very common emotion, which often comes tangled with immense guilt, is relief. Yes. Relief that the primary source of chronic stress, fear, manipulation, or direct abuse is finally gone. Relief from the exhausting burden of managing that difficult relationship. The cessation of re-traumatizing contact, the end of the constant anxiety or dread associated with their presence or potential actions.
And that relief, it must feel profoundly wrong to many people because it's about the death of a parent, right? Society doesn't exactly approve of feeling relieved.
Exactly. Society expects sadness, tears, mourning. Feeling relief can trigger deep shame and guilt, but the sources emphasize that your safety, your peace, your well-being are paramount. Relief in this context is often a normal, understandable, even healthy response to the removal of a significant source of harm or threat from your life.
Okay.
But alongside the relief, and sometimes far more powerful, is profound sadness and grief for what never was.
You mentioned this earlier in the context of no contact, but death makes it utterly final and irreversible, doesn't it?
Precisely. This is often the most poignant and painful aspect of this specific grief. It's mourning the loss of hope, hope for the parent they deserved but never had the kind, safe, loving, validating parent. It's grieving the lost opportunities for a healthy relationship, for feeling truly seen and loved by them, and perhaps most acutely, the lost hope for an apology, an acknowledgement of the harm caused, or some kind of true reconciliation or understanding.
The death slams the door definitively on any possibility of those hopes ever being realized.
It does. It's grief for an idealized or desperately longed-for connection, a fundamental human need that went tragically unmet by that parent, and now never can be.
Mourning a ghost, essentially. Potential parent who only existed in your desperate wish. That hits hard.
It does. It's a very particular kind of pain. Anger is also incredibly common and can surface or intensify after the death. Anger at the abuse itself, the depth of the pain caused over years, the stolen childhood, the lasting impact on their life now. Anger that the parent died without ever taking responsibility, facing consequences, or truly understanding the damage they inflicted.
Yeah, that lack of justice.
Exactly. Guilt is pervasive. Guilt for feeling relief, guilt for not grieving traditionally, guilt over unresolved conflicts or harsh words left unsaid, or maybe things said in anger that you now regret. Confusion is often high with the coexistence of all these disparate feelings churning inside. How can I feel relieved and sad and angry all at once?
And that profound sense of unfinished business must be huge.
Yes. The lack of an apology, the lack of acknowledgement of the reality of the abuse, the lost chance to confront them fully, to express the depth of the pain, to finally be heard and believed by them. The finality of death can make this unfinished business feel even more overwhelming and unsettling. There are no more chances. And ultimately, there's the final loss of hope, the definitive end of any possibility, however slim, of change, reconciliation, or creating any positive memories with that person.
So it's absolutely crucial to understand that all these feelings are valid, even the ones that feel contradictory or wrong according to societal norms about grief. The sources really stress this point.
Absolutely. The sources, particularly by outlining the common emotions and offering coping thoughts, like in Table 3 in one of the sources, emphasize that this complex, messy range of feelings is not only normal, but expected in the context of grieving an abusive relationship after death. Validation from supportive people, and especially therapists, is crucial because society often pressures survivors to grieve in a way that minimizes or ignores the reality of the abuse, which is incredibly invalidating.
How does therapy help navigate this specific, complex kind of grief? It sounds different from regular grief counseling.
It is different. The therapeutic process needs to provide a safe, non-judgmental space to explore and validate this entire messy spectrum of feelings without any pressure to conform to traditional grief expectations. It's less about getting over the death quickly and more about integrating the complex reality of the abusive relationship and the complex ending that death represents.
So validation is key.
The therapist's primary role is validating all the emotions, the relief, the profound sadness for what never was, the anger, the guilt, the confusion. Just normalizing that range is incredibly healing, especially when others invalidate the survivor's experience. You should be sadder, or don't speak ill of the dead.
And processing that deep grief for what never was seems central.
It is. Therapy focuses on actively mourning the wished-for parent, the denied childhood experiences, the lost hope for reconciliation or apology. It's about acknowledging the profound impact of those unmet needs and letting yourself feel the sadness associated with that loss. Inner child work can be particularly powerful here.
How does that work in this context?
Connecting with the part of you that experienced the abuse and desperately longed for parental love and safety, and providing that needed care, comfort, and validation internally now, maybe through guided imagery or dialogue, where your adult self tends to that child part's grief and unmet needs.
And addressing that unfinished business when the person's actually gone. How do you do that?
Since external resolution with the deceased is obviously impossible, therapy facilitates addressing it internally. Techniques like writing unsent letters to the deceased, pouring out everything you need to say, empty chair dialogues where you speak aloud to the imagined presence of the parent, or guided imagery where you have an imagined final conversation. These can help express what was left unsaid, process pent-up emotions, and achieve a sense of internal release and closure even without their participation.
It sounds like trauma-informed care is absolutely essential here, maybe even more so, given that death rituals and family interactions can be massive triggers for past trauma.
Absolutely non-negotiable. A trauma-informed therapist understands that things like funerals, wakes, memorial services, or even just increased interaction with remaining family members who may have enabled the abuse or deny it can be significant triggers. They can send the survivor spiraling back into intense trauma responses or CPTSD symptoms. Prioritizing the survivor's emotional and physical safety in navigating these events is paramount. Paradoxically, though, removing the external presence of the abuser through death can sometimes become a catalyst for deeper healing.
How so?
Because it removes the source of ongoing re-traumatization and conflict, it can bring unresolved internal issues related to the abuse more acutely to the forefront, making this period, while intensely difficult, also a critical window for specialized therapeutic support.
So this period, while intensely difficult, can also be a really important time for focused healing work.
Exactly. And therapists need a nuanced understanding of complex grief related to abuse. Traditional grief models often don't fit this experience well and can inadvertently rewound or invalidate the survivor by pushing for forgiveness or focusing only on positive memories that might not exist.
What kind of coping strategies do the sources suggest for navigating this specific challenging period after the death?
Robust strategies are definitely needed to manage the intense emotional distress and navigate the potentially very challenging family dynamics. Prioritizing self-care is absolutely fundamental, basic, but crucial for regulating a nervous system that is likely already dysregulated by the trauma history and now is dealing with the stress of grief and family interaction.
What does that look like?
Basics like ensuring adequate sleep, decent nutrition, some form of gentle exercise, and consistently utilizing mindfulness and relaxation techniques like deep breathing to calm the system, just tending to your basic needs when everything feels chaotic.
And dealing with family dynamics after the death must be incredibly complex and potentially triggering.
Oh, it is, and it requires significant energy and planning. Navigating family dynamics and setting boundaries is critical. Attending a funeral or memorial service, for example, is a deeply personal decision. There is absolutely no right or wrong answer, and the sources stress the importance of honoring your needs, your limits, and your capacity, regardless of external pressure or expectations from others. You don't owe anyone your presence if it feels unsafe or harmful to you.
What about dealing with different reactions from family?
You'll likely encounter varied responses. Some may be supportive, but others may deny the abuse ever happened, idealize the deceased parent, they were always so good to me, or judge your reactions to the death. Why aren't you crying? Setting clear and firm boundaries is essential for survival here. This might mean limiting contact with certain relatives, disengaging from conversations that are invalidating or triggering, choosing not to participate in specific rituals, or leaving family events early if they become overwhelming or unsafe.
Seeking out supportive connections sounds vital here too, maybe more than ever.
Crucial. Leaning on trusted friends or chosen family is incredibly important. These relationships, built on mutual respect, understanding, and validation, are often far more significant in healing than biological family ties, especially if the biological family was complicit in the abuse, enabled it, or is now invalidating your experience.
So rely on the people who actually get it and support you.
Yes, and it can help to educate your trusted supporters about CPTSD, complex grief, and potential triggers so they can provide better, more informed support. And importantly, choosing your support wisely, actively, avoiding dismissive or judgmental people who don't respect your boundaries, as that interaction can be re-traumatizing in itself. Building and nurturing this healthy support network is an active part of recovery and a vital buffer against the stress of this period.
Journaling or other forms of creative expression sound like they could help process these messy, conflicting feelings too.
Absolutely. They offer safe outlets for exploring and making sense of the complex, contradictory emotions without judgment. Writing, art, music, movement, whatever works. And perhaps most importantly, throughout this period, the sources emphasize patience and self-compassion. Healing takes time, it's nonlinear, grief comes in waves, and the intensity of feelings can surprise you long after the death. Be patient with yourself during waves of intense emotion or when triggers pop up unexpectedly.
Yeah.
The sources also highlight the potential for secondary stress, the stress that comes from those external pressures and difficult family dynamics, especially if the family system enabled or denied the abuse for years. Honoring your unique process, even if it feels unconventional, like feeling mostly relief, is paramount for authentic healing and continuing to reclaim your agency in the face of these external pressures. Psychoeducation about complex grief can empower you to understand your own reactions and resist that pressure to conform.
All of this really points towards redefining what closure means in this context. It sounds very different from the traditional idea of a neat resolution, tying things up with a bow, or simple forgiveness.
It absolutely does. For survivors of parental abuse, closure after the parent's death is rarely about a sudden feeling of completion or achieving traditional forgiveness or forgetting. It's primarily an internal process. It's about meaning-making, narrative reconstruction, and a gradual emotional shift that allows you to move forward with more peace and a stronger sense of agency, even with the unresolved aspects.
So internal closure, making peace within yourself.
Yes, finding a way to make peace with the reality of the past abuse and the reality of its ending, even without an external apology or acknowledgement ever coming. It's about changing your relationship to the memory of the abusive parent and the traumatic experiences. It's less about changing the past, more about changing its hold on your present. And a big part of that is creating a new narrative for your life.
Telling your story from a different perspective, emphasizing your survival and growth.
Exactly. Reframing the past by focusing on your survival, your resilience, your strengths developed because of or in spite of the adversity, and your growth since then. The sources use the beautiful image of panning for gold, consciously looking for lessons learned or any positive moments or qualities you can salvage, if any existed, while actively choosing to release the filth and soot of the abuse itself. It's about writing your own ending to the relationship story, one that emphasizes your journey of overcoming, healing, and moving beyond victimhood towards thriving.
And letting go seems key to that. Letting go of the burden.
It is, but it's an active, ongoing process, not a one-time event. Letting go involves consciously releasing the heavy burden of chronic anger, resentment, or that painful, futile hope for the abuser to change or apologize, which kept you tied to them emotionally. It's not about condoning the abuse at all. It's about freeing your emotional energy that was tied up in the abuser and the dysfunctional dynamic and redirecting that precious energy towards your own healing, your own well-being, and your future.
Building a legacy of healing feels like a really powerful way to find meaning in all that pain, to honor the struggle.
It is incredibly powerful. It's about actively choosing to break the cycle of abuse in your own relationships and how you parent if you have children and how you treat yourself. It's about transforming your story from one solely defined by pain to one of resilience, courage, learning, and positive change. Finding meaning in using your experience to build something better. And forgiveness, if chosen, is described in the sources primarily as self-focused in this context.
Forgiving yourself, not necessarily the abuser.
Yes. The most constructive form of forgiveness here is often forgiving yourself for anything you feel you did wrong in the relationship, for not being able to fix the parent, for surviving when maybe others didn't, for perceived weaknesses, or for the guilt you carry. Forgiving the abuser, if that personal choice is made down the line, is generally framed as releasing their emotional hold on you, freeing yourself from the bonds of resentment, rather than excusing their behavior, forgetting, or desiring reconciliation, which isn't possible anyway. It's for your peace.
So ultimately, redefining closure after the death is about reclaiming your power and agency.
Yes, the focus shifts definitively from the deceased parent and the inescapable past to your capacity to shape your present and your future. The healing journey itself, however difficult, becomes a powerful testament to your inherent strength, your resilience, and your commitment to creating a life of meaning and peace despite the profound wounds you carry.
Okay, so the journey isn't just about processing the past, whether the parent is alive or dead. It's very much about actively building a future, reclaiming your life, moving forward.
Absolutely. That's the crucial shift. Moving from surviving to truly thriving. It's about consciously reclaiming those parts of yourself that were damaged, suppressed, or underdeveloped because of the trauma. It's your self-esteem, your sense. It is utterly foundational. It involves cultivating genuine self-love and consistently, consciously challenging that negative self-narrative, which, as we've said, is often the internalized voice of the abuser repeating criticisms and put-downs relentlessly.
How do you challenge it effectively?
It's about using positive self-talk and affirmations, not just as wishful thinking, but as deliberate practice to consciously replace the inner critic's voice. It's built by celebrating small victories and accomplishments, noticing your capabilities, engaging in joyful activities that foster a sense of competence and pleasure. Therapy is crucial here too, helping to identify and restructure those deep negative beliefs. I am defective, I am worthless, and deconstruct the abuser's narrative to build an internal, stable sense of worth that is independent of any external validation or lack thereof. It comes from within.
And reclaiming agency, that sense of being the author of your own life, not just a passive recipient of circumstances or others' actions.
Yes. Trauma, especially inescapable childhood trauma, often creates learned helplessness, a profound feeling of having no control, no power. Reclaiming agency is about developing what the sources refer to as self-safety.
Self-safety.
Yes, the crucial internal capacity to accurately assess your inner experience, your relationships, and your environment for genuine safety cues versus trauma-based threat perceptions. It means learning to trust your intuition again, that gut feeling that something is off or something feels right. Gaining confidence in your ability to take protective action, like setting and enforcing boundaries effectively. Agency is also built incrementally, bit, by making small, deliberate, self-affirming choices every day, decisions that align with your needs and values, reinforcing your capacity to act in your own best interest, proving to yourself you have control now. Trauma-informed therapy inherently supports this by empowering the client, honoring their choices, and co-creating that sense of safety and control within the therapeutic relationship first.
So it's not just having insights in therapy, but actively putting them into practice in your daily life, making choices that reinforce your power now.
Exactly. It's an experiential journey that requires consistent action and practice, supported by the deeper understanding and healing work done in therapy. Another critical piece of reclaiming your life is fostering healthy attachment patterns and cultivating secure relationships in adulthood. This is huge.
Yeah, because parental abuse fundamentally disrupts the development of secure attachment, right?
Absolutely. Survivors often carry insecure attachment styles, maybe anxious, fearing abandonment, clingy, avoidant, fearing intimacy, pushing people away, or disorganized, a confusing mix of both, into their adult relationships. This manifests as deep trust issues, a fear of vulnerability and intimacy, or repeating those chaotic relationship patterns.
Which makes building healthy, lasting connections incredibly difficult. So how do you change that?
Fostering healthy attachment in adulthood is absolutely vital for fulfillment, but it takes conscious effort. It involves internal work, understanding how your early history shaped your current relationship patterns, why you might fear abandonment or closeness, why you struggle with trust. And building that internal self-worth we just talked about is foundational. Then it's about practicing new ways of relating, first in the safety of the therapeutic relationship, and then gradually in chosen relationships outside therapy. Setting healthy boundaries is a cornerstone of this. Non-negotiable.
You cannot have healthy relationships without clear boundaries, period. Seems like a mantra for survivors.
It really should be, period. It means understanding your needs, your limits, your values, and your expectations, and being able to communicate them clearly and respectfully, even when it's uncomfortable. Learning to say no without excessive guilt, protecting your emotional and physical space, and refusing to tolerate disrespect are crucial skills often never learned or actively punished in abusive homes.
In communication.
Practicing open and honest communication is key, expressing your own thoughts, feelings, and needs directly, vulnerably, but appropriately. And also actively and empathetically listening to others, trying to understand their perspective. Building trust gradually is essential after betrayal trauma. Trust isn't something you just give away freely after being deeply hurt. It's earned. It develops slowly over time by observing consistent, reliable, respectful behavior from others. You allow trust to grow organically at your own pace.
And actively choosing healthy partners and friends is paramount, right? Not repeating the pattern.
Crucial. Breaking the pattern means learning to identify red flags early on, controlling behavior, manipulation, lack of empathy, disrespect, inconsistency, and consciously seeking desired qualities like kindness, integrity, empathy, reliability, mutual respect, surrounding yourself with people who are genuinely good for your well-being.
People who uplift you, not drain you.
Exactly. And taking relationships slowly. Avoiding the tendency to either rush into intense intimacy immediately, often driven by a desperate need for connection, or avoiding connection altogether, driven by fear of harm. Allowing intimacy and trust to build a comfortable, safe pace for you. A key indicator of healing in this area is a gradual shift in expectation, moving from unconsciously expecting harm, abandonment, or chaos in relationships to gradually being able to expect and receive care, stability, and mutual respect. It's a long, challenging, but incredibly rewarding process of learning to relate from a place of greater security and authenticity.
And underlying all of this, the self-worth, the agency, the relationships, is establishing and maintaining a profound sense of safety, both internal and external.
Absolutely. This is the bedrock, especially when your primary caregivers, the people meant to be your ultimate protectors, were the source of threat. Establishing safety for a CPTSD survivor isn't just the absence of external danger, like leaving the abusive situation. It's cultivating internal safety, a felt sense of security within yourself, a trust in your ability to cope, and the capacity to maintain protective boundaries.
Can you break down the different kinds of safety?
Sure. Physical safety is the basic level, ensuring your living and working environments are physically safe, which sometimes requires making significant life changes. Emotional safety means being in relationships and environments where you feel you can express your genuine feelings, your vulnerability, your anger, your joy, without fear of being judged, shamed, dismissed, punished, or abandoned. It's about feeling seen, heard, and accepted for who you truly are.
Okay.
Psychological safety is having your thoughts, opinions, and experiences respected. Feeling able to speak up, ask questions, disagree respectfully, or admit mistakes without being ridiculed, humiliated, or having it negatively impact your self-worth or the relationship.
And then self-safety, that internal capacity you mentioned earlier, that seems really key.
It's the crucial internal capacity. Learning to accurately assess your own inner experience, your feelings, your needs, your triggers, your relationships, and your environment for genuine cues of safety versus reacting automatically based on past trauma. Trusting your intuition again, that gut feeling that tells you something is right or wrong for you. Having confidence in your ability to set and enforce boundaries to protect yourself. Making decisions that consistently prioritize your well-being, even if they are difficult or disappoint others. Maybe creating proactive safety plans for potentially triggering situations.
And understanding and regulating your nervous system is a huge part of this internal safety, isn't it? You mentioned polyvagal theory.
Yes, it's a really useful framework for understanding this. Polyvagal theory, developed by Dr. Stephen Porges, helps us understand how our autonomic nervous system constantly scans the environment for cues of safety and danger, and how it shifts between different states based on those cues.
What are the states?
It identifies three main states. The ventral vagal state, associated with the myelinated vagus nerve, which is where you feel safe, calm, connected, socially engaged, and able to cope. The sympathetic state, the classic fight or flight response, mobilizing you for action when threat is perceived, leading to anxiety, mobilization, maybe anger. And the dorsal vagal state, a more primitive shutdown response, associated with the unmyelinated vagus nerve, leading to feelings of numbness, dissociation, collapse, or feeling frozen when feeling overwhelmed, trapped, or perceiving life threat.
And trauma survivors often get stuck outside that safe ventral vagal state.
Exactly. Their nervous systems often become chronically dysregulated due to the repeated trauma, spending much more time stuck in those sympathetic, hypervigilant, anxious, reactive, or dorsal vagal, numb, checked out, collapsed states. The window of tolerance for stress is smaller.
So understanding this helps explain why you might feel constantly anxious or completely shut down, even when there's no current danger.
Precisely. And the healing goal, informed by this understanding, is to increase your awareness of your own nervous system state. Where am I right now? And learn practices like grounding techniques, conscious breathing, specific movements, mindfulness, or co-regulation through connection with safe others that help you gently guide your system back towards that ventral vagal state of feeling safe, connected, and capable more often and more readily. It's learning to befriend and work with your nervous system, not fight against it.
So establishing safety isn't a one-time fix like finding a safe apartment. It's an ongoing, dynamic process of internal and external attention.
It's absolutely ongoing and dynamic. It requires continuous self-awareness, consistent boundary maintenance, ongoing assessment of your relationships and environments, and consciously prioritizing your well-being moment by moment. For survivors of parental abuse, cultivating this deep sense of internal and external safety is a profound act of self-reclamation. And it's often essential foundational work before the deepest layers of trauma processing can be fully effective and integrated. You need to feel safe enough in the present to even look at the profoundly unsafe things that happened in the past.
And finally, the ultimate goal, beyond just managing symptoms or feeling safe, is creating a genuinely fulfilling life, moving beyond just surviving day-to-day to actually thriving.
It is. This is where you consciously shift focus from primarily managing symptoms and processing the past to actively building a life filled with meaning, purpose, connection, and joy. After trauma, especially chronic childhood trauma, the capacity for positive experiences can sometimes feel limited, unfamiliar, or even scary. It may require conscious effort and intention to cultivate them.
Where do you start with that?
Identifying your core values is a crucial step here. What truly matters to you at your deepest level, now that you're freer from the abuser's values or the need to just survive? Is it compassion, creativity, connection, justice, learning, autonomy, adventure, peace?
Using those values as a compass for your life now.
Yes, they become the compass guiding your choices, your goals, and your behaviors, ensuring your life feels aligned with what gives you a sense of meaning and authenticity, not dictated by the echoes of the past or others' expectations. Pursuing meaning and purpose involves actively engaging in activities, work, or relationships that feel significant and connect you to something larger than yourself, whether that's a fulfilling career, volunteering for a cause you believe in, engaging in creative pursuits, developing a spiritual practice, or nurturing deep, meaningful relationships.
And reconnecting with joy and pleasure, that sounds important, but may be difficult after trauma.
It can be difficult. Trauma can numb this capacity, make positive feelings feel undeserved, or even trigger anxiety because feeling good wasn't safe in the past. So actively seeking out and allowing yourself to experience pleasure, fun, and joy is an important act of healing and reclaiming your life. Rediscover old hobbies that got lost, explore new interests, spend time in nature, practice savoring small moments of pleasure, the taste of coffee, sunshine on your skin. It might take practice to overcome internal resistance to feeling good, to tolerate positive feelings.
Setting goals seems important for moving forward purposefully, too.
Yes, setting realistic and meaningful goals aligned with your values and aspirations provides direction, motivation, and a sense of accomplishment as you achieve them. Breaking down larger goals into smaller, manageable steps can make them feel less daunting and build momentum. And nurturing continued personal growth is part of thriving, too. Seeing life as a lifelong journey of learning, self-discovery, and refining skills contributes to a richer, more resilient, and more fulfilling life.
So fulfillment isn't about achieving some state of perfect happiness where the past pain is gone. It sounds more like the presence of new meaning, authentic connections, and a strong sense of agency in the present and future, woven together with the reality of the past.
Exactly. It's about actively defining yourself by your values, your passions, your choices, and the life you are consciously creating now, rather than allowing the trauma narrative to be the defining characteristic of your existence. The trauma is part of your history, an important part that shaped you, but it does not dictate your potential for happiness, connection, or contribution, or who you are capable of becoming.
This has been an incredibly deep and comprehensive dive into a really difficult, but ultimately, I think, hopeful topic. It's clear that healing from the profound impact of parental abuse and CPTSD is a complex, challenging journey.
It absolutely is, and we've really tried to explore the nature of these complex wounds, the unique challenges of navigating relationships with abusive parents, whether they're living or have passed, the power of specialized therapy, including modalities like IFS and schema therapy, and the absolutely vital work of rebuilding your sense of self, cultivating healthy relationships, and establishing internal and external safety.
And remember, as you navigate this, healing is rarely, if ever, a straight line. There will be ups and downs, moments of intense difficulty, triggers, setbacks, and also moments of profound liberation, insight, and joy. Through it all, self-compassion is probably your most essential tool, your superpower.
Absolutely. The skills you gain along the way, emotional regulation, boundary setting, self-awareness, challenging negative beliefs, connecting authentically, and the insights you uncover aren't just about managing symptoms in the short term. They are tools for lifelong growth, evolution, and building a life that feels authentically yours, integrated and whole.
The ultimate goal isn't to erase the past, because, well, you can't. It's to integrate it into your story in a way that allows you to move forward, so that the trauma doesn't continue to dictate your present or your future. The abuse is part of your history, but it is not the defining chapter of who you are or who you can become.
By engaging with this material, by seeking appropriate, specialized support, and by actively, courageously working towards creating a life aligned with your values and aspirations, you are moving beyond just survival. You are reclaiming your life. You are breaking cycles, potentially for generations, and you are opening the door to a future filled with possibility, purpose, and authentic joy.
So a final thought to leave you with. What does reclaiming your life look like for you? What is one small, manageable step you might take this week? Maybe even today, based on something we discussed. Perhaps it's looking up one of the books or resources mentioned, trying a simple grounding technique next time you feel overwhelmed, or taking that first brave step towards exploring trauma-informed therapy options in your area.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive today.